4 men laughed the moment he stepped onto the wooden auction platform. The trader presenting him tried to shout above the noise of the market, but the laughter spread faster than his words. One buyer covered his mouth in disgust and turned away. Another shook his head and said loudly that no master in Mississippi would ever pay money for a man that ugly. Yet the same man they mocked that morning would later become one of the most feared fugitives in the Mississippi Valley. His name was Moses Walker. Welcome to Shadow of Black History, the place where hidden truths, forgotten courage, and untold resistance finally come into the light. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time there right now. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the world, and if you have not subscribed yet, please subscribe and like our channel, so you never miss the powerful stories we uncover here. We truly appreciate every one of you. Stay with us until the very end, because this story is something you will not want to miss even a single paragraph of. Now, take a moment to relax, remove every distraction around you, and pay very close attention as we begin our story. The slave markets of Mississippi during the late 1840s were loud, chaotic, and deeply cruel places. Traders shouted prices while plantation owners examined enslaved men and women with cold calculation. Buyers judged people quickly. They looked at shoulders, arms, posture, and teeth. Strength meant profit. Youth meant long years of labor. A man who appeared strong and healthy could be sold within minutes. But Moses Walker was different. When the trader first brought him onto the platform that morning, in the year 1849, the crowd reacted with confusion before the laughter began. Moses was tall and strongly built, but his face told a difficult story. Deep scars stretched across his cheek and jaw. One of his eyes carried the dull look of someone who had endured repeated punishment. His nose had clearly been broken years earlier and never healed properly. Those scars made the buyers uncomfortable. Slave markets were cruel places, but buyers still preferred workers who looked physically appealing and healthy. Scars suggested trouble. They suggested past resistance, punishment, or illness. For traders who relied on quick sales, appearance mattered more than humanity. One buyer stepped forward and studied Moses closely. He circled him slowly before muttering a sentence that the entire crowd soon repeated. "Too ugly to sell." The phrase spread through the market like a spark through dry grass. Men laughed openly, while others shook their heads. The trader tried to continue the auction, lowering the price again and again in hopes that someone would see value in the man standing silently on the platform. But the buyers had already turned their attention elsewhere. Within minutes, the trader gave up. Moses Walker was led away from the auction block without a buyer. For slave traders, this was more than embarrassment. It meant lost profit. Every person who remained unsold cost money for food, transport, and supervision. Traders preferred quick transactions, not workers who frightened away buyers. Eventually, Moses was transferred to a small cotton plantation located several miles away from the river markets. The owner of that plantation believed that even an unwanted worker could still pick cotton. Life there followed the brutal rhythm common across Mississippi plantations. Before sunrise, enslaved workers were forced into the fields. The cotton stretched endlessly across the land in long white rows beneath the burning southern sun. Overseers rode slowly along the edges of the fields, watching every movement with cold attention. Punishment was common. If a worker slowed down, the overseer noticed. If someone collapsed from exhaustion, the overseer noticed. The whip was always nearby. Moses Walker worked quietly. he rarely spoke. He did not argue with overseers or attract attention in the fields. To the plantation owner, he appeared exactly as the slave traders had described him. Worthless. But Moses was observing everything. Each day, while working in the cotton rows, he studied the surrounding land. He noticed where the forest began beyond the edge of the plantation fields. He memorized the narrow paths used by hunters who sometimes crossed the property. At night, he listened carefully when travelers stopped near the plantation house to speak with the owner about roads, rivers, and nearby towns. Information was powerful, and Moses Walker collected it patiently. Months passed, then a full year. During that time, he began speaking quietly with a few others who shared the same dream. Freedom. Those conversations were dangerous. Enslaved people who were caught planning escape often faced severe punishment. But desperation made people brave. Slowly a small group formed, meeting in hidden corners of the plantation after dark. Moses explained what he had learned. The forest beyond the fields was deeper than most overseers realized. Several narrow streams crossed the land and eventually flowed toward larger rivers farther north. If they traveled carefully and avoided the main roads, it might be possible to disappear into those woods before patrol riders could track them. The plan required patience. Weeks passed as they prepared quietly. They gathered scraps of food whenever possible and studied the movement of the patrols who sometimes rode past the plantation. Finally, the night came. The sky was dark with heavy clouds, and the moon remained hidden. The plantation slept quietly, while distant insects filled the air with soft, buzzing sounds. One by one, the small group slipped away from their cabins. Moses Walker led them towards the edge of the fields. Behind them lay the plantation where they had been forced to work under constant watch. Ahead of them stretched the dark forest that might hold freedom or death. They entered the trees without a sound. By the time sunrise reached the cotton fields, the group had already traveled miles beyond the plantation boundaries. When the overseer discovered the empty cabins that morning, panic spread quickly across the property. Riders were sent into the surrounding countryside searching for tracks. Dogs were brought from neighboring plantations in hopes of catching the scent. But Moses Walker had already guided the group deep into the wilderness. The forests of Mississippi were vast and unforgiving, yet they offered something the plantations did not. Cover. Dense trees swallowed footprints. Swamps slowed horses. Narrow animal trails twisted through the land in ways that confused even experienced riders. For several days the group traveled north, resting only in hidden places where patrols were unlikely to pass. Eventually they reached a region where the plantation roads grew fewer and the wilderness stretched wider. There, Moses Walker made a decision that would change his life forever. Instead of continuing north to disappear into distant territories, he turned back towards the plantations. He had seen too many people trapped in the same system he had escaped, and he believed he could help them. Over the next months, Moses began moving carefully through the forests near several plantations. He studied river crossings and hidden trails that connected distant areas of the countryside. When he found enslaved workers willing to risk escape, he guided them through the woods, exactly as he had guided the first group. At first, the escapes were small. 2 people, 3 people. Sometimes only 1. But the pattern soon became clear. Plantation owners began noticing that workers were disappearing from their properties. Slave catchers searched the forests, but each time they followed a trail, it vanished into the swamps. Whispers began spreading across the region. A man with scars across his face was helping enslaved people escape. Some said he appeared suddenly in the woods during the night. Others claimed he knew secret paths that no patrol rider could follow. The name spoken in those whispers was Moses Walker. The same man once mocked in the slave market had become a growing threat to the system that tried to own him. Soon posters offering rewards for his capture began appearing in nearby towns. But the hunters searching for Moses Walker did not yet understand something important. The man they were chasing had already spent years studying the land they were riding across, and in the forests of Mississippi, knowledge of the land could be more powerful than any reward poster. The slave considered too ugly to sell had become something far more dangerous. He had become a guide to freedom, and his story was only beginning. The first rumors about Moses Walker spread quietly across the cotton fields of Mississippi. At first, they sounded like nothing more than whispered hope among tired workers who spent their days beneath the burning southern sun. But whispers travel quickly in places where people are desperate for change. Within months, the story of the scarred man moving through the forests had reached plantations miles away from the place where Moses had once labored. Workers began speaking about him during the few moments they had after dark, when the overseers finally returned to the plantation house. They spoke quietly inside their cabins or beside small cooking fires that barely lit the ground around them. Some said they had seen him standing near the tree line at the edge of a field just after sunset. Others claimed he had appeared beside a narrow forest path and guided a small group away without a sound. Whether every detail of those stories was true did not matter as much as the hope they carried. For people living under the constant threat of punishment, the idea that someone like Moses Walker existed meant something powerful. It meant the plantations were not unbreakable. Meanwhile, plantation owners were becoming increasingly alarmed. Reports began reaching them that workers were disappearing during the night. Sometimes only one person vanished from a cabin. Other times, small groups slipped away together. Overseers searched the nearby woods each morning, hoping to follow tracks through the soft dirt. But those tracks always disappeared. The forests of Mississippi were not easy places to search. Thick trees grew close together, and tangled vines covered the ground. Swamps stretched across the land in long patches of dark water where horses could not easily travel. Even experienced hunters sometimes lost their way beneath those heavy canopies of leaves. Moses Walker knew that wilderness well. After his escape, he had spent months studying the forest paths, the streams that cut through the land, and the narrow ridges that allowed travelers to move through the swamps without sinking into mud. Those lessons now allowed him to guide others quietly away from the plantations. He traveled mostly at night. During the day, he rested in hidden places deep within the woods, where patrol riders rarely ventured. Fallen trees, thick brush, and small caves along riverbanks became temporary shelters where he could remain unseen. The groups he guided were usually small. Moses understood that large groups left too many tracks and attracted attention. 2 people could move silently through the forest. 3 people could still hide beneath the trees. But anything larger than that risked discovery. Each journey required patience. Sometimes Moses would spend several nights observing a plantation from the edge of the forest before approaching anyone. He studied the routines of the overseers and waited for the right moment when the guards were least alert. Only then would he quietly reveal himself to the people who were willing to escape. Many who later remembered those moments described how calm he appeared. The scars on his face were impossible to ignore, but his voice remained steady. He never promised that the journey would be easy. Instead, he spoke honestly about the dangers ahead. Long nights of walking, cold river crossings, the constant risk of being discovered by slave patrols. Yet even after hearing those warnings, people still chose to follow him, because the life they were leaving behind offered no hope at all. Word of Moses Walker eventually reached the ears of slave catchers who made their living hunting fugitives. These men were experienced trackers who understood how to follow footprints across open ground and through shallow streams. They traveled with trained dogs capable of detecting human scent over long distances. At first, the slave catchers believed Moses would be easy to capture. After all, they reasoned, he had once been a plantation worker like any other. How difficult could it be to track one man moving through the countryside? But the hunters quickly discovered that Moses Walker was not an ordinary fugitive. Every time they followed a trail into the forest, the tracks suddenly vanished. Sometimes the footprints ended beside a narrow creek where water erased all signs of movement. Other times, the trail led into thick swamps where horses could not continue. The hunters returned empty-handed again and again. Frustrated plantation owners began offering rewards for information about Moses Walker. Notices appeared in nearby towns describing the scarred man who was encouraging enslaved workers to flee. The posters promised money to anyone who could reveal his location. Yet the people who saw those posters often reacted differently than the plantation owners expected. Some quietly removed them. Others ignored them entirely. In small farming communities scattered across Mississippi, not everyone supported the system of slavery. A few individuals who encountered Moses Walker during his journeys chose to offer silent assistance instead of betrayal. A farmer might leave food beside a trail without asking questions. A boatman might allow someone to cross a river during the night. These small acts of kindness made Moses Walker's work possible. One autumn evening, he guided a group of 3 men and a young woman through a narrow forest path that followed the edge of a river. The water moved slowly beneath the moonlight, while distant frogs croaked along the banks. The group had been walking for hours, their legs aching from exhaustion. The young woman stumbled on a root and nearly fell. Moses reached out quickly to steady her. They paused beside the river while he studied the opposite bank. Patrol riders sometimes traveled along that side, and he needed to be certain the path was clear before continuing. After several silent minutes, he nodded and motioned for them to follow. The crossing was cold and dangerous, but the water helped hide their scent from any dogs that might be searching behind them. One by one, they moved through the river until they reached the far shore. Once across, the group rested briefly beneath a cluster of tall trees. The young woman looked at Moses and asked a question many had asked before. "Why do you keep doing this?" He considered the question carefully before answering. "Because someone helped me once." His words were simple, but the meaning behind them carried weight. For Moses Walker, the work of guiding others was not about revenge against the system that had mocked him in the slave market. It was about creating opportunities for people who had none. Over time, the legend of the scarred guide grew even stronger. Enslaved workers across Mississippi began speaking about him as if he were part of the forest itself. The man once dismissed as worthless had become a symbol of courage. The man buyers refused to purchase had become someone slave catchers could not capture. And somewhere in those vast southern forests, Moses Walker continued walking beneath the trees, guiding others through darkness toward the future the slave market had never imagined for him. As the seasons passed, the forests of Mississippi seemed to carry the name Moses Walker from plantation to plantation. The story of the scarred man who guided people through the wilderness grew larger with every successful escape. What had begun as quiet whispers inside cabins after dark slowly turned into something much more powerful. Hope. Enslaved workers began watching the edges of the forests more closely. When the sun dipped below the trees and the overseers returned to their homes, some people looked towards the shadows as if expecting a figure to appear there. Sometimes Moses did appear. But not always. He had learned early that survival depended on patience. If he approached the plantations too often, slave patrols would begin watching those areas carefully. Instead, he traveled in wide circles across the countryside, sometimes disappearing for weeks before returning to regions where people had begun waiting for him. His movements confused the hunters. Slave catchers rode long distances, trying to follow rumors about where he might be hiding. One week they searched the swamps along the Yazoo River. The next week they rode south towards smaller plantations scattered across the countryside. But each time they arrived, the trail was already cold. The forests protected Moses Walker in ways the hunters did not fully understand. Thick tree cover made it difficult to track footprints. Streams and muddy ground erased the signs of travel. Narrow ridges running through the swamps allowed a careful traveler to move across the land without leaving obvious tracks. Moses had studied all of it. During the long months after his escape, he had walked through those forests until he understood the land better than most hunters. He knew which streams were shallow enough to cross quietly. He knew where fallen trees created natural bridges over swamp water. He knew which ridges could guide travelers safely through miles of wilderness without touching open roads. That knowledge made him dangerous to the system that once dismissed him. Plantation owners became increasingly frustrated. The disappearances continued. One plantation lost 2 workers during the harvest season. Another reported that 3 people had slipped away during the night after being seen speaking quietly with someone near the tree line. Each report strengthened the belief that Moses Walker was responsible. Soon the rewards for capturing him increased. Notices offering large sums of money appeared in nearby towns and along the roads used by traders traveling through Mississippi. The descriptions were always the same. A tall man with heavy scars across his face, one eye damaged, considered dangerous. Capture if possible. But the people reading those notices did not always react the way plantation owners expected. Some simply glanced at the description and continued walking. Others studied the paper carefully before quietly shaking their heads. In small communities scattered across the countryside, opinions about slavery were not always the same. A few farmers and travelers who encountered Moses Walker during his journeys chose silence rather than betrayal. Once, during a cold winter evening, Moses approached a small wooden cabin standing alone near the edge of a forest clearing. Smoke rose slowly from the chimney, while a dim lantern glowed through the window. He knocked gently on the door. The man who answered studied him for a long moment. The lantern light revealed the scars across Moses Walker's face clearly. Neither man spoke at first. Finally, the farmer stepped aside and allowed him to enter. No questions were asked. The farmer simply placed bread and warm water on the table. That night, Moses rested beside the fire before continuing his journey before sunrise. Moments like that reminded him that not everyone in the South supported the system that had tried to break him. But those moments were rare. Most of the time, he traveled alone or with small groups of people seeking escape. One spring night, he guided a young couple through a narrow trail winding between tall pine trees. The man had worked on a cotton plantation nearly his entire life. The woman carried a small cloth bundle containing the few belongings she had been able to take with her. They had been walking for hours. Their feet were sore and their legs trembled from exhaustion. Moses noticed their struggle and raised his hand, signaling them to stop. Ahead of them, the forest opened slightly, revealing a small stream flowing quietly through the trees. They rested beside the water. The young man finally gathered enough courage to ask the question that many had asked before. "Why are you helping us?" Moses Walker stared at the dark water, moving slowly across the stones. Then he answered, "Because someone once helped me believe I could be free." The couple remained silent after hearing his words. For them, the journey ahead still carried danger. Slave patrols continued searching the countryside. Dogs and horses could appear at any moment. Yet the presence of Moses Walker, walking ahead of them through the forest, gave them strength. By the end of that journey, they reached a region where the plantations became fewer and the wilderness stretched farther north. There Moses pointed them toward a road leading to people who might help them continue their escape. He did not travel with them beyond that point. Instead, he turned back towards the forests of Mississippi, because he knew there were others still waiting. The legend of Moses Walker continued growing. For the enslaved workers who heard his story whispered beneath the stars, he became something more than a man. He became proof that the system could be challenged. Proof that the same person once mocked and rejected in a slave market could rise to become the most feared fugitive in the Mississippi Valley. The slave traders who laughed at his scars could never have imagined how their judgment would be proven wrong. The man they called too ugly to sell had become someone their entire system struggled to stop. And somewhere beneath the tall trees of the southern forests, Moses Walker kept walking through the darkness, guiding others along paths the slave markets had never intended them to find. The deeper Moses Walker moved into his work, the more dangerous his life became. At first, the plantation owners had treated the stories about him as rumors created by frightened workers, but as the number of escapes increased, those rumors began turning into something they could no longer ignore. Plantation records started showing a troubling pattern. Workers disappeared from the fields without warning. Cabins were found empty in the morning. Tracks led into the forests but never returned. The overseers began organizing larger patrols. Groups of riders traveled along the plantation roads during the night, carrying lanterns and rifles. Dogs were brought in from neighboring farms to track anyone who attempted to run away. Riders inspected the edges of forests where trails might begin. Still, the disappearances continued. What made the situation even more frustrating for the slave catchers was that Moses Walker never behaved the way they expected a fugitive to behave. Most escaped slaves tried to travel quickly toward northern states and avoid being seen again. Moses did the opposite. He stayed in the south. He stayed near the plantations. That decision made him far more dangerous than the men hunting him understood. Because Moses Walker was not just escaping slavery, he was actively weakening the system that depended on forced labor. Every person he helped escape meant fewer hands in the cotton fields and fewer profits for plantation owners. The hunters eventually realized something else. Moses Walker was learning faster than they were. Every patrol they sent into the forest revealed something about how they searched. Every dog they released showed him how they tracked scent through the woods. Every rider who followed a trail into the swamp taught him which areas were easiest to escape. Instead of cornering him, the patrols were unknowingly helping him improve. One summer evening, a group of slave catchers believed they were finally close to capturing him. They had followed a trail through several miles of forest where broken branches and faint footprints suggested someone had passed through recently. The hunters moved carefully. Their horses stepped slowly across the uneven ground, while the dogs pulled eagerly against their leashes. The trail led them deeper into the woods, until they reached a narrow stream winding through the trees. There the tracks stopped. The hunters searched both sides of the water for several minutes. Nothing. One of the men cursed loudly as he stared at the empty bank. Moses Walker had already crossed the stream and walked along the water for nearly half a mile before leaving the riverbank. By the time the hunters arrived, he was already far beyond their reach. This was the pattern that repeated again and again. Every time the slave catchers believed they were close, Moses vanished into the wilderness. But the most powerful part of Moses Walker's story was not simply that he escaped. It was that he kept returning. Night after night, he walked the same forests where he had once worked as a slave. He approached plantations carefully, watching from the trees before revealing himself to those willing to risk everything for freedom. Sometimes the people he approached hesitated. Escape meant leaving behind family members who might not be able to travel. It meant entering a wilderness filled with unknown dangers. But Moses Walker never pressured anyone. He simply explained the path ahead. A path through forests, across rivers, north, toward places where slavery had less power. Many chose to follow. As the years moved forward, the legend surrounding Moses Walker continued growing. Some people began describing him almost like a spirit of the woods. They said he could appear silently beside a trail and vanish again before anyone could follow. Others spoke about the scars on his face. Those scars had once caused buyers to laugh in the slave market. Now they made him unforgettable. People who saw him rarely forgot the sight of the tall man with the broken nose and scarred cheek standing calmly beneath the trees. The very features that once made traders call him worthless had become part of the legend that frightened slave catchers. One autumn night, Moses guided a group of 4 men through a dense forest near the Mississippi River. The air was cold, and fallen leaves crunched softly beneath their feet. The youngest man in the group had never traveled beyond the boundaries of his plantation. The forest seemed enormous to him. After hours of walking, he finally spoke. "Why do they fear you so much?" Moses Walker slowed his pace slightly before answering. "They do not fear me," he said quietly. "They fear what I prove." The young man looked confused. Moses continued walking. "What do you prove?" the man asked. Moses Walker glanced back toward the distant plantations hidden beyond the trees. "I prove that they were wrong. Wrong about the man they laughed at. Wrong about the man they refused to buy. Wrong about the man they believed would never matter. The slave considered too ugly to sell had become the most wanted man in the Mississippi Valley. And somewhere beneath the endless canopy of southern forests, Moses Walker continued guiding others toward a freedom that the slave markets had once denied him. As Moses Walker continued moving through the forests of Mississippi, the tension across the plantations slowly began to change. At first, the slave owners believed they were dealing with a single runaway who had simply managed to survive longer than most fugitives. But after several years, it became clear that something larger was happening. Plantations across the region were losing workers, not in large numbers all at once, but in a steady and troubling pattern. One person would vanish from a cabin during the night. Weeks later, another would disappear from a nearby plantation. Sometimes 2 people slipped away together after being seen speaking quietly near the forest line at sunset. The plantation owners began speaking to one another more frequently. Meetings were held in plantation houses where men sat around heavy wooden tables discussing the growing problem. They shared the same name again and again. Moses Walker. Some plantation owners insisted the stories about him were exaggerated. They believed frightened workers were simply inventing a hero to inspire one another. Others were not so confident. They had seen too many empty cabins. They had watched too many patrol riders return from the forest with nothing to report. Eventually, the slave catchers changed their strategy. Instead of chasing rumors across the countryside, they began studying the plantations themselves. They watched the edges of fields more carefully. They questioned workers who seemed nervous or distracted. They rode patrol routes earlier in the evening, hoping to catch anyone attempting to reach the forest before nightfall. But Moses Walker had already anticipated this. He rarely approached plantations the same way twice. Sometimes he waited for weeks before contacting anyone. Other times he appeared during storms when the noise of rain covered the sound of movement. One winter night, heavy clouds covered the sky, while cold wind moved through the pine trees. The plantation fields were silent beneath the darkness. 3 workers waited near the edge of the forest, where tall grass met the first line of trees. They had heard whispers about Moses Walker from others who had escaped before them. The stories sounded almost unbelievable. A man once mocked in a slave market. A man who now guided people through the wilderness. The workers waited nervously. For a long time, nothing happened. Then a branch cracked softly behind them. They turned quickly. A tall figure stepped from the shadows of the trees. The lantern light from the distant plantation barely reached the forest edge, but even in that faint glow they could see the scars on his face. One of the men whispered the name quietly. Moses Walker. Moses nodded once. There was no long introduction. He simply motioned towards the dark forest. The journey began immediately. They walked through the woods for hours, moving carefully between tall pine trees and thick undergrowth. The wind masked their footsteps while clouds hid the moonlight. Eventually they reached a narrow creek where the water flowed slowly across smooth stones. Moses raised his hand for them to stop. He listened carefully. Far in the distance, the sound of horses echoed faintly through the night. Slave patrol riders were searching the area. The group remained completely still beside the water, while the sound of the riders slowly faded. Moments like this were the most dangerous part of every journey. One mistake could reveal their location. A snapped branch or a loud footstep could bring patrol riders crashing through the trees. But Moses Walker had learned patience through years of survival. Only when the forest returned to silence did he signal for the group to continue. They crossed the creek carefully and followed a narrow trail that climbed slightly uphill through the trees. By morning they had traveled many miles away from the plantation. When the sun began rising behind the forest, Moses guided them into a small valley hidden between low hills. There they rested. One of the men sat on a fallen log and stared at Moses with amazement. "Why did they laugh at you in the slave market?" he asked. Moses Walker looked down at the scars across his hands. "Because they thought a man's worth could be seen with their eyes." The man frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Moses glanced towards the forest stretching endlessly around them. "They looked at my face and believed they understood my future." He paused. "But they never looked at my mind." The group remained quiet after hearing his words. For the rest of that day they rested in the hidden valley while Moses studied the surrounding land. When night returned, they continued traveling north toward places where slave patrols rarely rode. Stories like this spread across the Mississippi Valley. Some people who escaped with Moses Walker eventually reached safer territories farther north. Others settled in hidden communities deep within the forests where they could live quietly, beyond the reach of plantation owners. But Moses himself rarely stayed in those places. Instead, he continued returning to the southern forests. Each time he walked back towards the plantations, he knew the danger was growing greater. Slave catchers were still searching for him. Rewards for his capture had increased. His name had become known across several states. Yet none of that stopped him, because every time he saw the fear in the eyes of someone still trapped in the fields, he remembered the moment when traders laughed at him on that auction platform. They believed his scars made him worthless. They believed his appearance meant he would never matter. But the slave considered too ugly to sell had become the one man their entire system could not control. And somewhere beneath the endless canopy of southern forests, Moses Walker continued walking through the darkness, proving that the judgment made in that slave market had been the greatest mistake those traders ever made. As the years passed, the legend of Moses Walker became larger than the man himself. Across Mississippi and parts of Louisiana, enslaved workers whispered his name in ways that sounded almost like a prayer spoken in the darkness. Some believed he moved through the forests like a shadow that could not be caught. Others said he had memorized every river crossing, every hidden path, and every swamp trail between the plantations and the northern roads. For the plantation owners, the situation had become deeply troubling. Their wealth depended on the labor of the people they enslaved. Cotton fields stretched across miles of land, and every missing worker meant fewer hands to harvest the crop. Yet the disappearances continued. One plantation would lose a worker during the night. Another would report that 2 people had vanished after being seen speaking quietly near the forest edge. Each time the same explanation appeared. Moses Walker. The slave catchers began growing desperate. Some of them had spent years hunting fugitives and had captured many runaways before. But none had faced a man like Moses. He understood their tactics, studied their habits, and adapted to every new strategy they attempted. The hunters tried using larger patrol groups. Moses began guiding people through deeper forests where horses could not travel. They tried releasing dogs trained to follow human scent. Moses began crossing rivers more often, knowing that running water erased the scent the dogs depended on. They tried waiting near plantation edges where runaways might appear. Moses began approaching from directions no patrol expected. The hunters soon realized they were chasing someone who learned from every encounter, and that made him extremely dangerous. One humid summer evening, a group of slave catchers believed they had finally found the trail they had been searching for. Fresh footprints crossed a narrow dirt road near a small plantation several miles north of the Mississippi River. The prints were large and deep, suggesting a tall man had passed through only hours earlier. The hunters followed the trail into the woods. Branches snapped beneath their boots as they moved carefully between thick trees. Their dogs pulled forward eagerly, sniffing the ground and whining with excitement. The men believed the hunt would finally end that night. But Moses Walker had anticipated their arrival long before they reached the forest. From a ridge hidden among tall pines, he watched the riders enter the woods below. The moonlight revealed their lanterns swinging through the trees while the dogs strained against their ropes. Moses waited silently. He had already guided the group traveling with him across the ridge earlier that evening. They were now far ahead, moving toward a river crossing that would hide their trail completely. The hunters below were chasing footprints Moses had deliberately left behind. After several minutes, he turned and disappeared quietly into the darkness. By the time the slave catchers reached the ridge, they found nothing but cold earth and silent trees. This kind of strategy allowed Moses Walker to survive year after year. He rarely fought the hunters directly. Instead, he confused them, misled them, and allowed the wilderness itself to become his greatest ally. For the people he guided, those journeys remained terrifying. Traveling through forests at night meant constant danger. A snapped branch could alert patrol riders. A barking dog in the distance could mean hunters were nearby. Even exhaustion could become deadly if someone stumbled or slowed the group. But Moses Walker never rushed his decisions. When danger approached, he stopped and listened. When a trail became unsafe, he changed direction. And when the people following him grew afraid, he reminded them of something simple. Freedom required patience. One autumn night, he guided a young man named Elijah through a long stretch of swamp forest. Elijah had escaped from a plantation only the night before, and still trembled with fear. As they rested beside a fallen tree, Elijah looked at the scars across Moses Walker's face. "Is it true they laughed at you in the slave market?" he asked quietly. Moses nodded. "They said no master would buy a man who looked like me." Elijah studied him carefully. "Do you ever think about that day?" Moses stared into the darkness for a long moment before answering. "Yes." Elijah waited for him to continue. "Because that was the day they proved how little they understood." The young man frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Moses Walker looked towards the forest stretching ahead of them. They believed a man's value could be judged in a few seconds. He paused before speaking again. "They looked at my scars and thought they saw weakness." Elijah said nothing. Moses stood and brushed leaves from his hands. "But those scars were proof that I survived." The two men resumed walking through the swamp, their footsteps disappearing beneath layers of fallen leaves and soft mud. By the time dawn approached, they had already traveled several miles beyond the plantation where Elijah had once lived. Stories like this spread quickly across the Mississippi Valley. People spoke about the man with the scarred face who moved through the forests, guiding others toward freedom. Some claimed he had helped dozens escape. Others believed the number was even higher. The slave traders who once laughed at Moses Walker could never have imagined how his story would unfold. The man they dismissed as worthless had become a symbol of resistance. The slave considered too ugly to sell had become the most wanted man in the region. And somewhere beneath the endless canopy of southern forests, Moses Walker continued walking through the darkness, proving again and again that the judgment made in that slave market had been completely wrong. Because the man they refused to buy had become the man they could never capture. As the legend of Moses Walker continued to grow, the tension across the Mississippi plantations reached a point where owners could no longer ignore what was happening. The escapes had become too frequent, too organized, too successful. What frightened them most was not simply that people were running away. It was the realization that someone understood their entire system and was quietly working against it. That someone was Moses Walker. Meetings between plantation owners became more serious. They gathered inside large plantation houses, speaking in low voices while studying maps of nearby forests and rivers. Some insisted that Moses must have help from outsiders. Others believed there were hidden communities deep in the wilderness where escaped people were being protected. But the truth was simpler. Moses Walker understood the land better than the men who believed they owned it. The Mississippi Valley was not just a region of cotton fields and plantations. It was also a vast wilderness filled with thick forests, winding rivers, hidden swamps, and long ridges of dry ground cutting through the marshes. For generations, hunters and travelers had used those hidden paths to move quietly through the countryside. Moses had spent years studying those paths. While working in the fields as an enslaved man, he had watched the forest edges closely. He noticed which trails animals used. He listened when hunters spoke about crossing rivers or navigating the swamps. And once he escaped, he spent months exploring those places until he knew them almost as well as the plantation owners knew their cotton fields. That knowledge turned him into something the hunters could not easily defeat. Every time a patrol group tried to surround him, he found another way through the wilderness. Every time they believed they had blocked the river crossings, he discovered another hidden path. And every time they increased the reward for his capture, the people living quietly in the countryside seemed less interested in helping them. One evening, late in the year 1853, Moses guided a small group through a dense section of forest not far from the Yazoo River. The group included 2 men who had escaped from a nearby plantation and a woman carrying a small bundle of clothing and food. They had been walking since sunset. The air was heavy and warm, and insects buzzed constantly through the trees. Occasionally an owl called from the branches above, breaking the deep silence of the forest. Moses suddenly raised his hand. The group stopped immediately. Far in the distance, the faint sound of horses echoed through the trees. Slave patrol riders. They were moving along one of the main plantation roads nearby. Moses listened carefully for several seconds before speaking quietly. "They are not looking for us yet," he said. "How do you know?" one of the men whispered. "Because they are riding too fast." The man looked confused. Moses explained calmly. "When they think someone escaped, they move slowly and search the ground. When they ride fast like that, they are only traveling between plantations." The group continued walking, moving deeper into the forest where the trees grew thicker and the moonlight barely reached the ground. Moments like this showed the people traveling with Moses why the hunters could never catch him. He did not simply run from danger. He understood it. Every sound in the forest told him something. Every broken branch or distant voice revealed clues about where the patrols might be traveling. By the time dawn approached, the group had reached a narrow ridge that stretched across several miles of swampland. The ridge was barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, but it allowed travelers to move through the marsh without sinking into the muddy water below. Few plantation owners even knew the ridge existed. But Moses Walker did. The group rested there while the first light of morning filtered through the tall trees. The woman in the group looked at Moses carefully. "Is it true what people say about you?" she asked. Moses glanced at her. "What do they say?" "They say you are the man the slave traders once refused to sell." Moses nodded slightly. "They laughed at me." The woman studied the scars across his face. "Do you hate them for that?" For a long moment, Moses Walker said nothing. The forest around them remained quiet, except for the distant sound of birds waking with the sunrise. Finally he spoke. "No." The woman seemed surprised. "Why not?" Moses looked out and across the endless trees stretching towards the horizon. "Because the day they laughed at me was the day they made their greatest mistake." He paused before continuing. "They believed I had no value." The group listened quietly. But that meant they stopped paying attention. Those words explained everything. The traders had dismissed him. The plantation owners had underestimated him. The slave catchers had chased him without understanding him. And because of that, Moses Walker had become something they could not control. A man who moved freely through the forests. A man who knew the land better than the hunters who chased him. A man who turned the insult of being called too ugly to sell into a life dedicated to helping others escape the same system. As the group prepared to continue their journey north, the young woman asked one more question. What will you do when everyone who wants freedom has escaped? Moses Walker smiled faintly. That day will not come soon. He stood and pointed toward the distant trees ahead. But every step we take brings it closer. And with that, the man once mocked in a Mississippi slave market continued walking through the wilderness, guiding others along the hidden paths that would slowly weaken the system that once believed he was worthless. The slave considered too ugly to sell had become the most wanted man in the Mississippi Valley, and the forests that once hid his escape had now become the roads of freedom for countless others who followed him into the unknown. By the middle years of the 1850s, the name Moses Walker had spread farther than anyone on that auction platform could have imagined. What began as whispers among enslaved workers in a few Mississippi plantations had slowly traveled across counties, rivers, and trading roads, in cabins lit by small fires, in fields where workers bent over cotton rows beneath the sun, and even among river boatmen who carried goods along the Mississippi, the same story appeared again and again. A man with scars across his face was helping people escape. To plantation owners, the story sounded like a threat. To the enslaved, it sounded like a promise. The hunters searching for Moses Walker were growing tired and frustrated. Some had spent years riding across the countryside, chasing rumors. They followed trails into swamps where their horses could barely move. They questioned farmers and travelers along dusty roads. Yet the man they were hunting continued to slip away. One hunter finally admitted something many of them had begun to suspect. Moses Walker was not simply running. He was planning. Every movement he made seemed carefully chosen. He approached plantations only when conditions favored escape. He traveled during storms when rain washed away footprints. He crossed rivers at places where the current was strong enough to hide the scent of dogs. And most importantly, he rarely followed the same path twice. This made the hunters feel as if they were chasing a shadow. One evening during late summer, Moses guided another group through the forest near the Mississippi River. The group consisted of two brothers who had worked together in a cotton field since childhood, and an older man whose hands were marked by years of labor. They walked slowly beneath towering oak trees while the insects buzzed in the warm night air. After several hours, the younger brother spoke in quietly. "Do you think they will ever stop hunting you?" Moses Walker did not answer immediately. Instead, he listened to the wind moving through the leaves above them. Finally, he replied, "No." The young man frowned slightly. "Then why keep doing this?" Moses stopped walking and turned towards the group. "Because someone must." His voice remained calm, but firm. "The plantations survive because they believe people are powerless." He looked towards the distant darkness where the cotton fields lay far behind them. "But every person who escapes proves that belief is wrong." The men traveling with him understood what he meant. For them, the journey ahead was about survival. But for Moses Walker, it had become something more. It was about breaking the confidence of a system that believed it could control every life within its reach. As the group continued traveling, the forest gradually began thinning. The land ahead rose slightly into dry hills where the swamp water disappeared and the ground became easier to cross. Moses knew this area well. From there, several roads led north toward regions where slave patrols were less common. Some travelers who reached those roads eventually found their way to communities that quietly helped fugitives continue their journey. Before sunrise, they reached a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. Moses stopped and pointed toward a narrow trail leading through the hills. "That road will take you beyond the plantations," he said. The older man looked at him carefully. "You are not coming with us?" Moses shook his head. "There are others still waiting." The two brothers exchanged glances. "You mean you are going back?" Moses nodded. They could not fully understand that decision. Freedom lay only a few days away for him if he continued north. He could disappear into territories where slave hunters rarely traveled. Yet he always returned, because somewhere beyond those forests were people still trapped in the same life he had escaped. The group thanked him quietly before continuing along the trail. Moses Walker remained standing in the clearing until their footsteps faded into the distance. Then he turned back towards the south, the direction where the plantations stood, the direction where the hunters were still searching for him. Years earlier, those hunters would never have imagined that the man they were chasing had once stood unwanted in a slave market. They could not have known that the trader who lowered the price again and again had unknowingly released someone who would challenge the system far more effectively than any buyer ever could. The slave considered too ugly to sell had become the most wanted man in the Mississippi Valley. Not because he sought power, not because he wanted revenge, but because he refused to accept the idea that a person's worth could be decided by traders shouting prices in a crowded market. As the sun slowly rose above the trees, Moses Walker disappeared once again into the forest shadows.